Welcome to Redemption Places YouTube channel. I pray that this sermon equips you and encourages you to go all in on Jesus. If you think you're too far gone, you're mistaken. If you think you're without hope, you're mistaken. No one is too broken. Redemption is coming.
All right, this morning, one of my favorite people is going to come share a little bit of her testimony and her story. And if y'all don't know Sherry, you should really get to know her. She's one of the best people that I've ever met. So here's her story.
Hey guys. Okay, thank you. So I know a lot of you have heard my story, my testimony, but the first of the week Nick asked me to give the part of when I got saved in jail. And as I've thought about this week, I thought a lot of times I leave all the details out on that part, and God made me realize this week that that's the biggest God story in my story. So, let's see. In 2005, I landed in Davis County Detention Center facing 10 years. And a couple of months before that, I had been working with this lady. Of course, I was in the madness, didn't want to hear nothing about God. Even though I was taught it all my life, I wasn't hearing it. And she had gave me a tape, and she said, if you don't do anything, just listen to this one time, if anything. And so I had listened to that tape one time. It was by Anne Graham Lotz. And in the middle of that tape, it just kept saying, give me Jesus, give me Jesus. So I had listened to that. And I remember it was the Thursday when I went to jail. I had been running for a while. And there was a girl who every evening asked me, hey, why don't you go to the church service with us? And I would just cover my head on the mat, and no. Every night I was saying no. And so on that Sunday, it was Mother's Day, and I had called my daughter, and she was like, Mama and Papa want you to call home. And I was like, no, I ain't calling there. My dad's never accepted a call from anybody in jail, never got anybody out in jail. He said, if you get there, get out on your own. And so I was very hesitant to call that day, but I did. And my mom said, your dad had been saving money from mowing yards because he was already retired. And she said, we will have your lawyer there in the morning. And so at that moment, I knew that nothing in this world could persuade my dad to do that but God. And so that night, I went to the church service, and lo and behold, the preacher preached on the prodigal son. And so at that moment, I was like, I hear you, God. Like, I know this is God. I know this is God. Like, I'm listening now. And so that night in that service, I gave my life to the Lord. And when we went back to the cell, and I kept telling and just to tell y'all this, like, God is always moving. Like, even when you don't know He's moving, He's moving. We went back to the cell, and all the girls gather around. I guess they, every night did that after the service and talked. And some of you in here, I see several people in here that I've done the jail ministry with. So y'all know, and part of this gets left out sometimes. So I told the girls, I was like, look, I cuss like a sailor, every other word. Like, this is going to take time. I'm going to have to work on this. And they was like, it's okay, it'll be okay. And I want y'all to know, in that minute, God took that from me just like that. So, not saying that I hadn't said a cuss word since, but you know what I mean? Like, I do know my vocabulary is not anywhere like it was before. And so that was another moment, like the Holy Spirit had just went through me, and I was like, a few days following, I was like, oh my gosh, like it's gone. Like, only God could have done that. So, I would lay in bed on the mat that night, and several nights behind, and I would talk to God. And I had never talked to God ever in my life, even though I was raised in church, you know what I mean, and knew. I had never talked to God like I did then. I prayed that I would, that He would be like, help me somehow get out of these charges, that I could be locked up for 10 years. I prayed that He would break the chains of addiction off of me and my kids, that I had started that cycle with my kids, and I can say today that also has been an answered prayer. Like, both of my kids live for the Lord, and the following days, my mom and my pastor at the time had came to the jail and talked to me, and then the next day the lawyer came, and he was like, I don't believe you're really, like, you're not this big drug dealer and making meth and doing all this. I think you're just with the wrong people, and I think I can help you. And so that I went to jail on Thursday, and that following Friday, I went to court, and I'll never forget the day walking in that courtroom, dressed out in orange, and looking at my mom and my pregnant daughter's face, knowing that they were going through more than I was going through. And so, like, that whole week, like, God was just going boom, 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 And so I got released, like, have to move back in with my parents and do all this, the things that you got to do to try to stay out of jail. And when I left the church service the night that I gave my life to the Lord, the women in there was telling me, like, if you don't do anything when you get out of here, you need to read The Purpose-Driven Life. Like, you have to get this, you have to read it, like, if you don't do anything. And so when I got to my mom and dad's that day, I told my mom what they had told me. And what do you know? She had the book on the shelf, yes. And so she was like, we don't got to go anywhere to do that because it's right here. And so I did read that. It's 40 days, 40 chapters. And like at that point in time, I was just trying to do everything like God. I know you've worked this whole week, so I want to do what I can do and the way you want me to do it. And I did that, and it was like, I actually kind of worked me through a lot of the CR or AA steps, and I did that, and I never looked back. And I just know that if it wasn't for God, I wouldn't be alive today.
I think it's just so awesome how God works. Like, what could be perceived as the worst week ever of her life turned into God at work. Like, what could be perceived as rock bottom, God met her right there in a jail cell, and Sherry has never looked back. Like, one of my favorite things about her, and like, she started a ministry in her home, God's Girls, and like, they go to Florida every year. And not only do they just go to Florida to hang out, they go and serve two places down there. I think it's a women's recovery center, Path of Grace, and they spend a week down there serving this ministry, and they have for years and years and years. And that's something that Sherry has started. If you want to go, you could probably go next year. It's probably too late this year. But like, it's just awesome to see God at work and what God can do. And I had Sherry kind of give her story because this week will be the last week of our series titled, I'm a Giver. If you've been with us this month, the whole series has been, I'm a Giver, and what we wanted to do was personalize that. Because we all know, whether you're in church or the world, there's givers and there's takers, right? There's consumers and there's contributors in any area of life, and as a church, I want us to be known as givers. If someone was to ask me about you, I would hope that I could say, she or he is a giver. They're a giver of their time. They're a giver of their talents. They're a giver of their treasure. And this week will be titled, I am a giver of our testimony. Truth be told, whether you've been in church one day or you've been saved 10 years, each one of you in this room has a testimony, and you have a story written out by God. Each person in this room could get up here, just like Sherry, and share your story. You can share probably moments of your life where you didn't know how you was going to make it through. You could share moments of your life where maybe you was in a jail cell, or maybe you was in a predicament and you seen God at work. Like, each one of us in this room has a testimony. You may not believe you do. Guess I've heard that, right? Like, I ain't got a testimony. Yes, you do. Each one of you in this room has one. Some of us just may not tell your testimony out of fear, or maybe you're just shy, or maybe you just don't think you have a powerful story, but everyone in this room can be a giver in this area. What makes a testimony so great is you don't have to be a college graduate to share your story. You don't have to use a bunch of big words to share your story, because guess what? It's your story. You don't have to be this PhD doctor to have a story about your life and God at work. It's yours and it's real. And the only way to not be a giver in this area is to be silent. That's the only way to not be a giver of your testimony, is to be silent about your story. And I think that the enemy has silenced Christians for far too long. I think he's silenced the church and our stories for far too long. So while the church has taken kind of a back seat of convenience because we don't want to seem too radical, right? Like, we don't want to share our stories. Like, we don't want to seem like that Christian who's always talking about God. But guess what? While we've taken a back seat, Twitter sold for $44 billion. Instagram is worth $102 billion. And Facebook is worth over $775 billion. You know why? Because people love sharing their stories. What does Facebook ask you to do? Share your story, right? Share your moments. Share your memories. And each and every day, like if you go to a concert, what do you see now? A bunch of people on their phones capturing the story, right? Hey, I'm here. Not really there. They're there through a screen, but you'll see the whole place phone up. And like we had a picture of it, but earlier this year, like LeBron James broke the all-time scoring record, and they showed the arena, and everyone in there had their phone on for that moment. You know why? Because they wanted to share the story on I was there when this happened. They wanted to tell about it. They wanted to post about it. They wanted for people to know about it, right? So every day we all live in a world where stories are blasted in front of our eyes. You get on Facebook, that's what you're reading. You're reading people's stories. You're seeing what they did that day. You're seeing how they lived their life. It's a never-ending story about what's going on. And oftentimes you can see like, oh, they're going through it, right? You can see chapters in their lives and memories. And that's one of my favorite things actually about Facebook is when old memories pop up. It kind of tells the story of your life and things that you've been through in seasons that you've been in. So while the world is givers of their stories and what's going on in their life, shouldn't we as Christians be even more bold about telling the work that God is doing in ours? I'm going to repeat that. While the world is being givers of their stories, every day they're being givers of their stories. Here's what's going on in our life. Here's what we're doing. Here's what's fun. Come join in with us. Shouldn't we as Christians be more bold about sharing stories about what God is doing in ours? See, personal testimonies are one of the best tools that we have to reach other people. Personal stories and testimonies are one of the best tools that you and I have to reach other people. You know why? Because a lost and broken world, they may not want to hear 10 Bible verses, but you know what's real to them? Sherry's story. They may not want to hear, hey, I know all the truths of the book of Revelation. But they may want to see your story, and they may have witnessed the change in your life. And that's what's real to them. You know what's real to some of your family members? Your story, your testimony. The way that you walk out this life is evidence that confirms to people around you that God must be real and God must be at work. Like, that's one of the biggest evidences. And I want a lost and broken world to ask you this. How did you find freedom? I want people like Sherry. How did you change from going in a jail cell to now you're interested in this book, right? That, hey, it just happens to be there. No, it didn't just happen to be there. God had it there, right? Like, God was already at work in the details. And I'm sure those around her asked her, hold up, like, what happened in jail? What pastor was at that service, right? Like, what happened? How did you change? Because you heard it. She went from someone who, church, yeah, see ya, to church Sunday night. I'm going, boom, my life has never been the same. And to those around her, her parents, her kids, that's realer than any Bible verse she could have ever shared with them. Each one of us in this room have our own story. And my prayer from this day on is it starts and ends with the most powerful 3-letter word ever spoken, God. That is where I hope your story starts, is with God. Because the world, they're telling stories about their self, right? They're promoting their self. They're lifting up their self. As Christians, our stories are promoting God because we know only He could do the changing. Only He could do the cleaning up. So if you have your Bibles this morning, we'll be reading in John chapter 9, verses 18 through 25. John chapter 9, verses 18 through 25. And it's quite frankly one of my favorite personal testimonies in the Bible because it's so simple. It reads, "The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received sight." I guess they thought he was just lying, like, hey, you wasn't really blind. Until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight. So there was a man, he was blind and he received sight. They didn't believe it until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight. Pause right there. Notice it didn't say they called a doctor to be like, oh, how did this happen? No, they wanted some personal testimony like, oh, you're his parents, tell us how this happened. So they asked them, is this your son who you say was born blind? So even in the way they asked that, they're almost discrediting, right? Like, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? Like, that's a good question, right? Because to be honest, if one of you was blind last week and drove this week, I'll be like, hold up, what happened? I'll be like, come on now, like you tricked me last week. Like, be honest. Like, so sometimes when we read the Bible, we're like, powerful story. No, like, let's put life to this story. If you came in blind last week, and this week you was like, hey, Nick, nice shirt. I'll be like, oh, you tricked me. But like, that's what they're doing, right? So that's what they're going through. But his parents answered, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind. Like, so he would have grew up and he would have been blind, right? But how he now sees, we do not know. Nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak, or in other words, he will testify for himself. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews has already agreed if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue, so there was consequences. Therefore, his parents said, he is of age, ask him. So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. And this is my favorite part of his testimony. This is my favorite part of his answer. He answered, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, though, I was blind, now I see. Like, that is his story. He's like, hold up. And I like how he said it in third part. Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, though, is I was blind and now I see. They could not take his story and what happened away from him. Let's think about how powerful his testimony is. It was a complete mic drop moment, right? It was one of the realest things that not only that they had heard, but they could see. They could visualize this miracle in front of their eyes. But over and over and over again, what did they do? They started out with, hold on, nope, can't be true. Let's ask his parents. And they didn't like the parents' answer, right? Like, yeah, he was blind, but we don't know how he sees now, but he's seeing. They didn't like their answer, so they asked him. How are you seeing now? And they didn't like his answer, so it said they asked him again, right? So they asked him over and over, like, how did this happen? How are you seeing? How are you walking around right now? Who changed you? That's the same question, if we're going to be givers of our testimonies, that I want people to ask you. I want people to ask you, who changed you? How did you change? Why are you in church right now? I want people to go to your parents even and start questioning them like, oh, how did this happen? I want people to go to your friends and be like, whoa, how did he change, man? Like, I see the evidence of it in his life. Is this real? When did this start? And notice the blind man didn't give them a medical update. He didn't give them a medical terminology, right? I once was blind and I went to the hospital and they did a medical experiment and I'm seeing now. He didn't say that, right? He didn't give them a medical update. He didn't say, well, I did this, so that happened. He just hit them with straight facts. He just hit them with what actually took place. He said in verse 25, look, I don't know what all you're talking about and all the questions you're asking. Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I'm sure on, though, and one thing that I can take to the bank is I was blind and now I see. They could never take that away from him. That was his testimony that he could share for the rest of his life. Did he need the biggest words ever to share that testimony? He didn't. Did he need to be college educated to tell people on what he had just experienced? He didn't. He didn't have to understand even all the truths of the Bible. He was just a witness to what God has done in his life. And that's my prayer for you and I, is to continue on in that witness. We are to be proclaimers of what God is doing, and guess what? Who it's more real to. Let's be honest. There are people who can give you the most accurate, correct answer you could ever hear, right? But what's more believable? Someone who can give you the straight-on answer that, hey, the medical terminology, or someone who's actually experienced it and lived it. There's a difference in the two, right? There's a difference that someone says like, hey, God can save in a jail cell. No, God saved me in a jail cell. That's two different completely things in the story. That's two different complete testimonies. And I think it's one thing to testify that God can heal. It becomes a lot realer when you've seen God heal. It's one thing to know in the head that God can save. It's a whole nother thing to know in the heart that God does save. It completely changes the story, right? That's why no one can take your testimony away from you but you. The only way that you can take your testimony away is for you to be silent and about it. And the enemy, he loves that. He loves when you feel like, oh, I've blown it now. Now I don't have a testimony. He loves for you to be like, well, I got to be silent now because I dropped the ball. Even though, look, you may have dropped the ball, guess who didn't? God. You still have a story to tell. And it's not your story, it's God's. I think one of the biggest things that we mess up is we think we have to have the, like, I love that Sherry said, like, well, he took my cussing away. Well, not quite, no, most of it. Because what the enemy does is he likes to tell you, you have to walk in perfection now, and that when you mess up, now you don't have a testimony anymore. That's a lie. I don't care if you've been one day saved or you're struggling to hold on to the fence, you still have a testimony. Even if you was to say, man, I'm struggling with belief, but I want to believe. Guess what? That's a testimony. I don't even want to go to church, but I'm going to go anyway. That's a testimony. I don't want to pray, but I'm going to pray anyway. That's a testimony. It doesn't always have to be roses and butterflies and skipping through the park, right? It could be, look, I don't even know what's going on in my life and how am I making it through this season, but I'm just trusting in God. That's a testimony. This blind man in John knew the truth. He knew that he was blind before, and now he isn't, and that's what a Christian testimony is all about. A Christian testimony is all about, I was once this way, and now I'm that way. I was once going down this path, and God interrupted it, and now I'm going down this path. I was once broken, but now I'm forgiven. I was once lost, but now I'm found. I was once blind, but now I see. That's my prayer for this church. I want each of us to experience how good God is. And as a result of us experiencing how good God is, I want us to go share that story with a lost and broken world. That's not a story to be silent about. When you realize how good God is, you share that with other people because you realize he's better than everything. And I get it. Like, you go around your family, you may feel like they don't want to hear it. You may feel like, oh, I share about God too much, and I'm here to tell you, you can't share about God enough. That's the greatest story that the world could ever hear. That's the greatest story ever told. And that's how Redemption Place is going to grow, if we're going to grow. Because what's real to those around you and every day is you sharing with people what you really believe. Like that, I want people to come here because they say, look, I seen them change. Let me go see what happened to them and let me go experience the change in his life. I need to go see if this is real. Like, that's more realer to those around you than almost anything else. But you see, the people in John chapter 9, verses 18 through 25, they didn't want to believe the truth, right? They didn't want to hear the truth. They didn't want to believe that this man had actually changed. They didn't want to believe that he was blind and now he was seeing, because it didn't fit in their little box of what should happen, right? It didn't fit in their little bubble of how things that were going to take place. And I would say the same is going to be true for you and those around you too. Not everyone is going to jump up and down as soon as you change. Like, a lot of people would love for you to stay the same. It makes a lot of people uncomfortable when you start, when you was this way, you was maybe drinking with them, you was partying with them, and now you're not. A lot of people are like, man, you need to go back with and do what you was doing. A lot of people ain't going to be happy that you've started to change, and we see this in these verses. Isn't it crazy that they wasn't like, wow, we seen a miracle? That should have been the response, right? Like, whoa, blind dude is seeing. How this happened? I need to, whoever did it, let me go let him pray for me, right? Like, that would be my response. Like, if I would see like something like that, I'd be like, man, I'm prayer circle, let's go. I need it. But that wasn't their response because they rejected the truth, because some people just don't want the truth. It could be right in front of their eyes, true change, true hope, and they reject it. The evidence of God's restoration could be right in front of them, and they still want a different path, and they still look a different way. So they start the interrogation again in verse 26, as if the other, whatever he said, didn't really matter. They said, well, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? Verse 27, he answered them, I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? I'm going to repeat that. I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? And that's where I'll share with you this morning. It's our jobs as Christians to just share the truth. It's going to fall where it falls. It's our jobs to just share our stories. It's our job to just share the work of what God is doing. It's not our job on whether people believe it or not. That's not your job, right? Hey, did they believe me or not? That's God's job to change them. It's not your job on whether they believe it or not, because it's still real and it's still your story. Whether people receive your story or your testimony or not, you keep sharing it. And you keep being a living, breathing, and walking, talking example of the grace of God. Like, that's our job, whether the people come running to it or running from it, is to be witnesses of God's grace, to be witnesses of the work that God is doing. And I want people to ask more and more and more, how did you change? How did you make it through that? How did you get through that storm? How did you make it through that season? How are you not drunk or high anymore? How are you not in a jail cell today? Why do you even go to church after all that you've been going through? And you know what those questions are? they're a perfect opportunity for you to share your story in the work that God is doing. I love when people ask that question. Nick, how did you change? How did you get where you are? What happened in your life? You was once a hooligan and now you're a pastor. What happened in that process? That's a perfect segue to say, look, let me tell you about my Jesus. Let me tell you about a good and faithful God who I was running away from but ran towards me. I want the people around you to ask those types of questions. How? Why? How are you doing this? How are you getting through this? Why are you in the Bible? Isn't God not answering your prayers? Hasn't God left you? And I want you to be like, never. That's why I love every time I hear Sherry's testimony. I've heard it a lot, but I love it more and more every time I hear it because that's so powerful, her story about how she got saved in a jail cell. Like, that doesn't fit a box, right? That doesn't fit a church bubble like, oh, hold on, she got saved in a jail cell. Well, let's make sure she follows through. Was it real? Like, I'm sure people around her was like, oh, yeah, we heard that before, jailhouse religion. Like, they have a term for that. Jailhouse religion. You know why they call it jailhouse religion? Because they don't expect you to walk it out after jail. They're like, oh, yeah, everybody's church in jail. Let's see after jail. I'm sure the people around her questioned whether she was going to continue living her story out, living that moment out or not, right? I'm sure they didn't just run, oh, Sherry's changed, let's go. I'm sure her parents even was like, yeah, let's see. Let's see if that bond money was an investment or not. Because look, she had probably went through that before, right? She had probably went through seasons of maybe changing and going back and changing and going back. So they probably thought, we've heard that before. But you know that makes her story more real every time she shares it. And it makes Jesus seem even more real, right? It makes you see God at work in the whole story in that she didn't want to go to church. She went to church. Perfect sermon, prodigal son. Perfect sermon that God had just for her in that moment, right? She gets out. Oh, they told me about this little book in there. I should go read it. Mom pulls it out. Oh, got the book right here for you. Been here for 3 years. Like, that's God at work. If you miss God in that story, you want to miss it. You can see God in the details of her story. And the less she shares it, the less that we get to be partakers in her testimony. I want her to share that story over and over and over again. Like, I want her to share her testimony to a lost and broken world. And you know why? Because there are other women right now who feel hopeless, who are in a jail cell, who needs Sherry to go back in there and be like, I was once right where you're at. I didn't want to go to church, and I know how you feel right now. But if she's silent about it or distracted, then those people don't get the gift of hearing how a good and faithful God saves. That's why I love when she said, I can look around this room and see people that I did jail ministry with now. Isn't that powerful? She went from being in jail to doing jail ministry. That's a part of a powerful testimony. Here's what I've learned over time, though. One of the biggest tricks of the devil is he wants to destroy your witness or your testimony. He wants to destroy your witness and your testimony. He wants to tear you down. He wants to take you out. He wants to destroy your witness. He wants you to feel like you don't have a story anymore. And that's why I'm here to remind you, you do have a story and you should share it. You have a testimony and you should share it. And that's not when you think you have it all figured out, but that's probably even when you don't have it all figured out and you're just hanging on to God anyway. That's still a story, right? Because oftentimes what the church does is they make you go through hurdles, right? Well, when you're 3 years doing good, share your story. I want to hear the story about, look, I don't even know how I'm making it right now, but God's good. I didn't even want to go to church, but I'm here anyway. That's a powerful story. And guess what? That's real. I don't want to hear a generic story, right? I ain't saying I don't want to hear it, but I want to hear a real story. It's like, look, I was about to end it all, and somehow God showed up. That's real. And I think we should share those stories even more. We should be bold about the work that Christ is doing. We should be bold about the gospel. We should be bold about life change. Next week, we're going to do baptisms for the first time in our church, right? And guess what? It's a big deal. I want you to invite all your friends and your family. I want people to celebrate that moment with you. You know why? Because you being baptized is evidence to them that God must be at work and God is real. It's not just a small moment. It's a celebration that we get to join in on. Worship team, you can come up. I want to ask y'all this morning. I want to ask you this morning, why couldn't your story change today? Why can't today be the start of a new story for you? Do you not think change is possible for you? If you was to be real, a lot of you in this room don't. Because that's how I grew up. I really believed that God could save. It was a lot harder for me to believe that God could save me. In my mind, I had done too much and went too far, and I was unlovable. But I realized that wasn't the truth. So what is stopping you from believing that today could be day one in the start of your new journey? That today could be the day that your chapter starts a new chapter. That from today forward, you're going to walk with God, and you're going to be bold about sharing your story. Not when everything's going great, but when everything's going bad as well. Why can't that be today for you? Why can't your story change right now? You know what it starts with? It starts with you knowing that God has to lead the way in this new story. That God has to be the leader in this new story. And I want you to know, God is always a way better leader than you could ever be. I used to want to write my own story, right? I used to want to be the author of my own story. Nick, create this great story. And then I realized I wasn't a great storyteller. Like, I would have never wrote this story for my life. If you would have asked me if I wanted to be a pastor 15 years ago, I would have been like, most boring thing ever. I would have been like, no way. That is not my story. Maybe yours, not mine. I wanted my story to be like, coolest guy on earth, right? I wanted my story to be like, Nick's awesome, and he's rich, and he has a big house, and he has a BMW, and all this, right? Like, that was the story I wanted to write. But guess what? God had a way better story for me than I could have ever wrote. He had a way better plan for me than I had a plan for me. And he has the same for you. Quit trying to take the pen from God and just say, God, you write my story. You be the author of my life. You lead my life. You dictate my steps. I'm going to follow your path, not my own. Wherever you say go, I'm going to go. And it's so cool when you look back and you see that, man, God was there every step of the way. That God was in the details of my life every step of the way. And every chapter was leading me straight to the cross and straight to him. God didn't just show up in the middle of my story when it was like, okay, Nick, focus on me now. God was there since my birth, even before my birth, and he was directing me right towards him. God is at work in the details of your life and my life And it's my suggestion and my prayer that you start letting him lead it. That you abandon all your thoughts of you being a better leader than God. He's a way better leader than you could ever be. You know why? Because he'll never forsake you. He's not giving up on you. He's not abandoning you when things go wrong. Like, that's one of my biggest blessings in any part of my story is two faithful reminders. Nick, God is for you and God is with you. All over my story, those two things are true. Nick, God is for you and God is with you. That's no matter what I'm going through. That's my two favorite reminders in life. Maybe some of you need to hear that in this season you're going through. God is for you and God is with you. He's not leaving you. He's not forsaking you. He's holding on to you. It's not you holding on to God. It's him holding on to you. So I'm praying from this day forward, all of our stories in this room change. Even if you've been a Christian for 10 years, you're like, Nick, I'm walking a pretty good story. There's more for you. There's more to the story. Go further all in, right? Go further in. God, I'm dependent upon you more. I'm abandoning my own way. God, I'm jumping all in on you. And let him write the story of your life. Some of you, like, your future leaders. Like Sherry didn't know 10 years ago when God, or however long ago, 15 years ago. How long, Sherry? 18. Oh, 18. Sherry didn't know 18 years ago in a jail cell that 10 years later, she would be taking a group of women to go serve in a shelter in Destin, Florida. You know who did know? God. God isn't surprised by it. He saved her for a reason, right? And I love it. Every year they go to Path of Grace, guess what? They share a testimony with those women. They share a testimony with those women, and it makes it real that change can happen. So if you've been running from God, it's time for you to come home. If you're lost, it's time to be found. If you're blind, it's time to open your eyes up and see. There will be people up here that if you need prayer, that we would love to pray for you. I would love to meet with you about baptisms. My daughter's getting baptized, praise God. I would love for this church to be a part of your story, whatever your season you're going through, whatever part of your journey you're going through. I would love to walk out your story with you in all seasons, not just in the good times, in the bad times. I would love for us to start sharing our stories. Like, let's flood social media, right? As Christians, like, we have one of the greatest platforms of our day. We should flood social media with before and after pics, with our stories, with God moments, with radical things that God is doing. Not shying back, but being bold about seeing God at work with stories of hope, with stories of redemption. And trust me, people are always watching. Sometimes you think, hey, I ain't reaching nobody. Ain't nobody listening to me. And then one day somebody will be in your inbox. Man, how did you change? I've been seeing the work that God is doing. Will you pray for me? Do you have any Bible studies for me to go to? Can I come to church with you? Like, how are we going to reach people if we're not bold about being out there to reach people? If we're just shying back, if we're just playing it safe, don't play it safe. Get in the game, go all in, and depend on God. I want our stories to scream out, God is good, God is faithful, and from this day forward, our stories are going to be led by him. Let's worship.
I've carried a burden too long on my own. I wasn't created.
Thank you for watching this sermon. I pray that it blessed you and pushed you closer to going all in on Jesus. I pray that you know He invites you in. He invites you to a place with Him. I pray that you know that you can find redemption in His name. If you was blessed by this sermon, you can give by mail at P.O. Box 552, Owensboro, Kentucky 42302, or you can give to Redemption Place on the Church Center app. I pray that you have a blessed day.